Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be talking about a tragic event that happened in a quiet town in North Carolina.
Carthage
Yeah,
in
Carthage.
2009.
Yeah, in March of 2009 on a peaceful Sunday morning.
It's one of those cases that just, probes the dark side of human nature and really,
Mhm.
uh, examines the motivations and circumstances that lead to such unimaginable acts.
Yeah, it's the story of the Carthage Nursing Home shooting a tragedy that left 8 people dead and a community forever scarred.
Right.
And we're here to kind of guide you through it piece by piece and try to understand not just what happened, but, the why.
Yeah, we're going to examine everything leading up to the
Yeah.
shooting, the background of the perpetrator, and then explore kind of what happened after in the community and beyond.
So picture this. It's a seemingly ordinary Sunday at the Pinelake Health and Rehabilitation Center. Residents are having breakfast, families are visiting staff or going about their routines.
Right.
Everything's tranquil and peaceful.
It's a normal Sunday morning.
Yeah, but this is all about to be shattered by a man named Robert Kenneth Stewart.
And Stewart arrives at this nursing home with the intention to cause harm. And he doesn't just show up with a single weapon.
Hmm.
He shows up with a .357 caliber handgun, a .22 Magnum semi-automatic pistol, and a 12-gauge Winchester 1300 shotgun.
It's chilling.
It really is. And
Yeah.
it speaks volumes, I think, about his state of mind at the time.
It's like something out of a nightmare. Why this arsenal? Why these specific weapons? Was it trying to make a statement, or was it maximizing the potential for carnage?
I think that's a question that investigators and psychologists have been grappling with since the incident. Was it a calculated decision based on the types of damage that each weapon could inflict, or was it driven by a more primal rage?
Either way, it's clear he came prepared
Oh, yeah.
for confrontation, and his first target is chillingly symbolic, his estranged wife's car.
Yeah, he didn't even wait to go inside the building. He
Yeah.
starts shooting in the parking lot, riddling her empty vehicle with bullets.
Like a message.
A message, a warning, trying to lure her out. We
Uh-huh.
don't really know.
But there's someone else in the parking lot at this time, a visitor named Michael Lee Cotton, who gets caught in the crossfire.
Cotton was just driving into the parking lot, and a bullet pierces his shoulder. Imagine the shock, the disbelief, the searing pain.
Yeah.
But Cotton, despite his injury, doesn't think of himself
No.
at all.
Incredibly, he runs into the nursing home warning everyone about the shooter. That's talk about courage under fire.
I mean, they say he probably saved lives that day.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a testament to the human spirit, I think.
Yeah. The instinct to protect others, even in the face of danger.
Yeah, for sure.
So meanwhile, Stewart, leaving behind the .22 caliber rifle, actually on top of a Jeep Cherokee, he enters the nursing home, and it's here that the real horror begins.
We need to pause here and acknowledge the terror that must have gripped the residents and staff inside. I mean, they're in a place of healing, a place where they should feel safe, and suddenly their world is invaded by this violence.
Yeah, and Wanda Stewart's estranged wife and a nurse at the facility, she's right in the middle of it all. Fortunately, she had been reassigned to the Alzheimer's unit that morning, and so when she hears the gunshots, she instantly understands the danger and hides in a locked bathroom.
That was really a stroke of luck, a twist of fate that spared her from becoming another victim.
But sadly, others weren't so fortunate. Stewart, driven by rage, we'll explore later, begins a methodical room-by-room search with his shotgun.
He just encounters residents, some of them in wheelchairs, utterly defenseless, and he doesn't hesitate, he doesn't discriminate, he just leaves a trail of victims in his wake.
7 innocent lives are extinguished that morning. Jerry Avant Jr., a nurse who heroically tries to intervene, Louise Deckler, Lillian Dunn, Tessie Garner, John Walter Goldston, Bessie Hedrick, Margaret Johnson, and Jesse Vernon Musser.
Wow.
Their stories, their lives are forever intertwined with this tragedy.
It's important to remember that these aren't just names on a list. These were mothers, fathers, friends, each with a rich history, a life story abruptly cut short.
And as this nightmare unfolds, the lone officer on duty in Carthage that morning, Corporal Justin Garner, receives the call that will change his life forever.
He races towards the nursing home, not knowing the full extent of the horror that awaits him, but knowing that every second counts.
Yeah, he's about to come face to face with pure evil.
And in that moment, he becomes the last line of defense between a heavily armed gunman and potentially more victims. It's a situation no officer should ever have to face.
But Garner, without hesitation, enters the building, his own life hanging in the balance.
The confrontation is about to unfold. You can cut the tension with a knife in that hallway.
Oh, yeah. Just a lone officer facing a man armed for war, knowing that lives are on the line.
And, you can practically feel that air thickening as Garner confronts Stewart.
Yep.
demanding he drop his weapon.
This is at the moment of truth.
Right. Will he surrender? Will he come to his senses?
Sadly, no.
Yeah.
Instead, he raises his shotgun and fires, striking Garner in the leg.
This could have been the end for Garner right there.
It could have been.
But he refuses to give up.
It's incredible. Despite the searing pain, the shock of being shot, he manages to return fire, hitting Stewart in the chest.
And that's the shot that ends the rampage. But not before Stewart utters this really chilling phrase.
Oh, yeah.
Kill me, kill me.
Haunting.
Yeah. It offers, I think, a little glimpse into Stewart's psyche at the time.
No remorse.
Nothing, no concern for the carnage he's unleashed. Just this desire for self-destruction.
Yeah, it's hard to comprehend the darkness that must have consumed him at that point. 8 lives lost, countless others shattered, and all he can think about is ending his own pain.
Right.
But before we get to the legal proceedings and the aftermath, let's step back and try to understand this man behind the gun who was Robert Kenneth Stewart before he became the Carthage Nursing Home shooter.
Well, it's tempting to just dismiss him as a monster, a purely evil being. But the truth, as always, is much more complex. Stewart, like all of us, had a past story that shaped him.
So let's rewind the tape, go back to his beginnings. What can you tell us about his early life?
Well, he was born in Robeson County, North Carolina, and later moved to Moore County with his family. On the surface, a fairly typical upbringing. But those who knew him back then describe him as a loner, a quiet kid who had trouble connecting with others. And there were whispers even then of a tendency to erupt in anger.
So the seeds of rage, the difficulty with relationships, they were already there.
Yeah, lurking beneath the surface.
And these patterns seem to repeat themselves as he enters adulthood. His personal life marked by instability, particularly his romantic relationships. We know about his troubled marriage to Wanda Neal, the estranged wife he was targeting that day, but that wasn't his first failed marriage.
No, not at all. In fact, Stewart had been married 3 times before Wanda. His first marriage ending after just a few months when he was only 18.
3 failed marriages before the age of 45. That's a lot of heartbreak, a lot of broken promises.
It is, and I think it points to a pattern, difficulty with commitment, with intimacy.
Did those relationships offer any clues about his capacity for violence?
Well, according to Wanda's family, Stewart was extremely possessive and controlling during their marriage. He would isolate her from friends and family, monitor her every move, and frequently explode in these fits of jealousy. There are even instances of physical abuse threats against her life.
So it's a classic case of domestic abuse, the escalation of power and control that can ultimately lead to tragedy.
And Wanda wasn't the only one who experienced Stewart's temper. There was a confrontation he had with a fellow member of his hunting club. Threats, intimidation. A simmering rage that always seemed to be just below the surface.
So we're seeing a portrait here of a deeply troubled individual prone to anger and violence, struggling with personal relationships. But were there other factors at play? Did he have any history of mental illness?
That's a crucial question. And it became a focal point during his trial. His defense attorneys argued that Stewart was suffering from undiagnosed mental health issues, and that this was compounded by his use of Ambien, a sleep medication that could have some pretty intense side effects.
Confusion, agitation.
Hallucinations even.
So they're essentially claiming that he wasn't in control of his actions that day, that the combination of his mental state and this Ambien led to a sort of temporary insanity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They pointed to the fact that Stewart had been acting erratically in the weeks leading up to the shooting, making strange calls to family members claiming he had cancer, talking about going away. They said this was evidence of a mental breakdown.
So a disconnect from reality. It's a compelling argument, especially when you consider, the bizarre nature of his actions. Did the prosecution buy it?
Not at all. They argued that Stewart's actions were deliberate and planned, driven by a very real motive, revenge against his estranged wife. They pointed to the arsenal. He assembled the fact that he targeted her car, the methodical way he moved through the nursing home.
So it became this battle of narratives, 2 competing interpretations of Stewart's state of mind.
And in the end, the jury sided with the prosecution.
What was the verdict?
Stewart was found guilty of 8 counts of second-degree murder, a verdict that reflected the gravity of his crimes, but also acknowledged the possibility that his mental state played a role, and he was sentenced to 179 years in prison.
Wow.
A sentence that guaranteed he would spend the rest of his life behind bars.
It's a sentence that brings a sense of closure, justice being served, but it doesn't erase the pain, the loss, the questions that linger long after the gavel falls.
You're right, it doesn't. And in the final part of our deep dive, we're going to explore the aftermath of this shooting, the impact on the community, and the broader societal questions it raises. So the courtroom verdict brings a sense of legal closure, but the wounds left by the Carthage Nursing Home shooting run much deeper
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just a crime, this was a trauma that rippled through the entire community.
and beyond.
Imagine living in Carthage in those days and weeks following the shooting, you know? How do you even begin to process such a senseless tragedy in a place like that where everybody knows everybody and where the nursing home was probably a familiar part of the landscape?
Yeah. I mean, it's almost impossible to overstate the collective shock and grief that just descended upon that town. This wasn't just a news story for them. This was a shattering of their sense of safety.
Yeah.
A stark reminder of just how fragile life really is.
We often focus, on the immediate victims in cases like this, but the ripple effect extends outwards, touching families, friends, first responders, even, people who just lived in the same town and felt that impact of this sudden
Right.
darkness.
The community definitely came together. In the aftermath, there were candlelight vigils, memorial services, an outpouring of support for the victims' families. But behind the scenes, the emotional scars ran very deep.
And let's not forget about the first responders who faced the horror head on the police officers, the paramedics, the firefighters who walked into that scene of carnage. They carry a heavy burden.
Yeah, absolutely. Creepy old Justin Garner, the officer who ended Stewart's rampage,
Yeah.
later spoke very candidly about the psychological toll that it took on him. He had to grapple with the trauma of being shot, the
Yeah.
weight of taking a life, even though it was in the line of duty.
It's a reminder that even heroes have their limits, that the human psyche can only endure so much. Did his experience lead to any positive changes?
Yeah, actually, Garner became a really vocal advocate for mental health support for first responders.
Yeah.
He used his platform to highlight the often invisible wounds that they carry and the need for better resources to help them cope.
It's a testament to his character that he transformed his personal pain into a force for good.
Absolutely.
Now, stepping back from the individual stories for a second, the Carthage shooting also ignited a broader national conversation.
Yeah, you're right. It forced people to confront some uncomfortable truths about gun violence, domestic abuse, and, the gaps in our mental health system.
Let's break those down one by one. First, gun control. How did this case impact the debate surrounding access to firearms?
Well, the sheer firepower that Stewart possessed, the arsenal that he meticulously assembled brought the issue of gun control right to the forefront. People started asking, how did he obtain these weapons? Were there any red flags that should have prevented him from owning guns?
It's a debate that continues to rage on with, very strong opinions on both sides.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But the Carthage shooting undeniably added fuel to that fire.
Absolutely. And then there's the issue of domestic violence.
Mm-hmm.
Stewart's history of abuse towards Wanda Neal, culminating in this horrific act, just underscored the deadly potential of this often hidden epidemic.
It brought to light, the need for early intervention, recognizing the warning signs, providing better support for victims, and holding abusers accountable.
Right.
And finally, the mental health aspect. While Stewart's mental state was a central point of contention during his trial, the case also exposed the shortcomings of our mental health system.
Absolutely.
We saw just how difficult it can be to assess someone's mental state, to determine their level of responsibility for their actions, especially when drugs are involved.
And it really raised questions about how we as a society identify and treat individuals who are struggling, how we prevent them from falling through the cracks, and how we balance the need for both compassion and accountability.
It's a tricky thing.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So this seemingly isolated tragedy in a small North Carolina town ultimately touched on some of the most pressing issues facing our society.
It really did. It forced us to confront these uncomfortable truths about the darkness that can lurk within individuals, and also, the systemic failures that can sometimes allow that darkness to flourish.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some key takeaways, for our listeners? What lessons can we learn from the Carthage shooting?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is the need for vigilance. Paying attention to those subtle signs of trouble, whether it's in our personal relationships, our communities, or even on a national level.
Yeah, we need to be aware of the warning signs of domestic abuse, mental health struggles, and the potential for violence. And we need to have these open and honest conversations about these issues without, shame or stigma.
Absolutely. And we need to support those organizations that work to prevent violence, that help the victims, and promote mental health awareness. And we also need to hold our elected officials accountable, for enacting policies that make our communities safer.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by the complexity of these problems, but every step we take, every conversation we have, every act of support, it can all make a difference.
We can honor the victims of the Carthage shooting, not by dwelling in despair, but by working together to create a world where such tragedies are less likely to occur. A world where help is readily available, warning signs are heeded, and communities are united in their commitment to safety and well-being.
Well said. That's a powerful message and a fitting end to our deep dive into this very difficult topic. Thank you for joining us on this journey.